Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone, and tēnā koutou katoa. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to the Link University Excellence Series, the first one for 2025. These seminars highlight the outstanding research and outreach produced by Lincoln University, celebrating the contributions of distinguished academics while engaged with national and international audiences. Through this series, we hope to foster public discussions on key issues that impact the nation and communities in particular. Tonight, it's a pleasure to introduce Professor Greg Ryan, who's had a long association with the university, and we have a privilege from hearing from Greg. He is a leading historian who delves into social, cultural, and economic dimensions of sport in New Zealand in particular. He is also one of the Link University's proctors at this point in time, who plays a very important role. Professor Ryan's research explores the historical development of sport, with a particular focus on rugby and its deep connections to New Zealand's national identity. His work examines how sport has shaped and been shaped by broader societal changes, including economic factors, amateurism and professionalism, and the role of institutions in governing athletic competition. Beyond rugby, Greg has investigated the historical intersection of alcohol, leisure, and public policy, and she'll talk about tonight, offering valuable insights into how these elements have influenced social behaviour over time. His scholarship not only deepens our understanding of New Zealand's sporting history, but also contributes to global discussion on evolution of sport and society. Welcome, Greg. It's a pleasure to have you here today.
It's just to do something when I click, but it's not going to, so we'll get on. No, it's actually it's an anticlimax. We're frozen. Anyway. Good occasion before. Lovely to see everybody. The networking nibbles won't disappoint. Look, before I interrogate the New Zealand Holy Trinity and the bovine interlopers in my title, I think it's important just to offer a few reflections on how on earth a historian came to be at Lincoln and how that circumstance has shaped my research over the years. I came here in 1998 in the halcyon days of the Bachelor of Social Science degree, when the university was looking for charismatic staff to energise its students. What immediately became apparent to me with being only 2 historians deep, and very deep by the looks of that photo, I could not hide in my historical niche. In fairly short order, I was teaching everything from Polynesian voyaging and settlement to Ruth Richardson's Mother of All Budgets, and most things in between. And that grounding, that requirement to sort of be grounded right across the full screen of New Zealand's history, I found vitally important in recent years in 2 major projects which have traced their topics through numerous contours of New Zealand history. So much as the university is predicated on research-informed teaching, I've always put in a vote for teaching-informed research. The second key component to me, when teaching history to non-history majors in a fairly applied university, one is extremely conscious of the need to link that history and make it relevant to the present. And so consequently, I periodically come back to this whakataupu. Now, look, the links between the past and the present scarcely need to be stated in 2025, when some people are trying to turn the Treaty of Waitangi into a one-act parody. But it's a point that's just worth keeping in mind more generally. Links between past and present and the importance of stressing those links. The third important element to me that really shaped some of my thinking and where I ended up going research-wise was in some of what we were teaching, and that particularly was the process that created the New Zealand pastoral economy, I guess, to the point where by the early 20th century, New Zealand was regarded as Britain's outlying farm, sustained by something like 85% or more of our exports going into Britain. And in that context, there were really strong notions of a sort of rural Arcadia. What I mean by that is a very strong belief that life in the countryside, on the land, owning land, was in all ways superior to life in the city. There was a real sense, I think, in some of those who settled these islands and some of those who encouraged them to come, that the empire, the British Empire, was sort of rotting at its old world urban core, and there might be salvation out here. In trying to pursue and make sense of those things, I drew on a number of things. I went back to my very first life as an American Studies major. Not always certain that one should admit such things these days. And Frederick Jackson Turner's frontier thesis, the notion that movement westward in the States and winning the wilderness created a particular sort of character type, rugged individuals, progressive, democratic, somewhat anti-authoritarian in outlook. Now, there are various criticisms of the Turner thesis, but that broad idea as it feeds into mythology is not without significance. The second strand came from my first teaching experience in Australian history down the road, and Russell Ward's Australian Legend, and the idea that the experiences of surviving and then thriving in the Australian bush apparently created a particular sort of egalitarian mateship, which served the Australian male well later on when they were under challenge on the battlefields of Gallipoli or Kokoda or similar. But what actually intrigued me with Australia, still does, is how one of the most significantly urbanised countries on earth, as it is, has a self-image that is so strongly linked to the bush and the outback. I think it's worth our while to ponder the same question with respect to urban New Zealand and its self-image. The third strand here was a British one, Raymond Williams, The Country of the City, and particularly a notion of cycles of nostalgia. What Williams was getting at was that each generation tends to believe that it's the one witnessing the decline of the countryside and the encroachment of the city. Williams pointed out that there's about 600 years worth of generations who believe that, which tends to put some of our presentist concerns in perspective. So that was all very nice. I was finding the rural myth, and I was intrigued by the rural myth, that what was being outlined in New Zealand history resonated in other parts of the world. But for a time, that rural myth was going off down this path, and my research life as a mild-mannered sports historian was going down another path. Then one day they collided. That day was Monday, the 1st of November, 1999, around about 4:35 a.m, give or take, when this happened. A much hyped All Blacks team had a severe attack of headless chickenism, for want of a better term, and lost a Rugby World Cup semi-final France. Now, later that morning, I got a call from the political editor of the press saying, "What impact do you think that this result will have on the mood of the nation and hence of the forthcoming general election?" I pointed out that I actually thought that Jen Shipley's coalition government had long since signed its own death warrant. What I didn't point out was that I'd fallen asleep marking exam papers and missed the game. And to this day, I still haven't watched it. But what came out of this, and that interaction, was something of a fascination with how do countries interpret apparently catastrophic sporting failure. I suppose some people go for the micro explanations, such as the novel one that the other team may have played better, or that the referee was a bias-blazing incompetent. What's tended to happen over the years is that people go for the macro explanations, that the failure of the sports team is somehow due to major wrinkles in the fabric of the society. And whilst I was pondering that, this letter arrived in the press. Now, for those of you who are not intimately acquainted with All Black forward packs, Richard Lowe was the quintessential All Black hard man of the late 80s and early 90s, although a thoroughly nice bloke by all accounts. I could very easily dismiss this letter as the deluded ragings of somebody who only committed themselves to writing because the talkback lines were overloaded. But there was more to it than that. The further I went into this, what became apparent was that there was a deep-seated and reasonably consistent belief in some quarters of New Zealand that the backbone of rugby in particular, the rural backbone, its traditions and the clubs of the back blocks in the heartland, had somehow been betrayed by soft urbanism, by corporate greed of the cities, by professional rugby having turned professional in 1995. And I think the belief that the game was now dominated by too much money and not enough mongrel. If you put the words mongrel and rugby into a New Zealand search engine, incidentally, you get a significant amount of connection. It's a really intriguing theme. So it was clear that there was a deep-seated sort of explanation of the failure of the All Blacks in terms of an undermining of core rural values. It didn't help that the All Black coach at the time, John Hart, was a somewhat smooth-talking ex-Fletcher Challenge executive. But there was another dimension to this too. It wasn't just that the present state of the game had apparently been betrayed by urbanism. It was that the next generation were also being betrayed. In the hands of prominent long-serving journalist Warwick Roger, an argument came through about the feminisation of the teaching profession. That young men coming through, we are not discussing women's rugby in this context, that young men coming through, again, had been betrayed. There was a de-emphasis on competition. There was no emphasis on the science of scrum formation as proxy for a physics lesson. There was too much emphasis, supposedly, on the rights of Wales, not the nation. And again, this may look slightly outlandish, but it's a consistent theme that one can trace through quite a number of sources. It applied in '99. It applied in 2000 as the New Zealand Olympic team seemed to fail to meet some people's expectations. It was evident in 2003 when the All Blacks again failed to win the Rugby World Cup, although I completely missed that one because the semi-final was our wedding night. It was evident again in 2007 when the All Blacks failed to win the Rugby World Cup. And it's been evident subsequently in a sort of a malaise that rugby generally, rural rugby more specifically, has somehow been undermined, ruined, destabilised by these urban forces. So in that context, I wanted to understand what were the origins of rugby and what had it lost, if anything. And if you follow the work of previous historians of the New Zealand game, both academic and popular, the myth seems to stack up. In 1876, all of these small towns had rugby clubs. It's great, the game was taking hold of the countryside. But at that point, we run into an issue between the enthusiasm that is required to start a sports club, be it rugby or anything else, and the effort that's required to sustain them. All of these clubs were gone within 2 to 3 years. But 1876 looked good. The entire history of New Zealand rugby through many of its formative decades is one of lack of continuity, in especially the small towns of the provinces. Clubs and competitions rise, other priorities take over, and as they go into recess, they come back again. Only in the 4 main cities, they weren't particularly large cities even then, do you find the critical mass to really sustain the continuity of competition over time. And that became one of the crucial arguments of our sport in New Zealanders as well, that really sort of the upper echelon of the New Zealand sporting pyramid, sense in terms of consistent participation, representation, was fairly urban. So that was one part of it. I was then drawn across a few fairly wet afternoons to number crunch the All Blacks. If rugby had a strong rural backbone, then it followed that the national team, as the epitome of the game, as the publicly visible epitome, was similarly composed. But it wasn't. Number crunching from the 1880s through to present, your All Black team was always significantly more likely to be drawn, not from the back blocks, but from the clubs and teams of the 4 main centres. And where it starts to converge a bit in the 70s, it's a bit deceptive, because then you really have to add in the secondary cities, the Hamiltons, the Palmerston Norths, and others, which reinforces a portrayal of a strongly urban game. But wait, said one of my fiercest critics, raised his voice at me at a historical association conference. You've got it all wrong. It's the frilly and effeminate backs who come from the cities. The farmers, as we all know, are full. Exhibit A, full of meats. Te Kuiti farmer, voted New Zealand rugby player of the 20th century. Man who supposedly trained by carrying sheep up hills under each arm. Although when I went into Google Images and put in the words Colin Meads and sheep, the only thing that came back, which looks to me slightly more like a cuddle than a carry, but anyway. Meads is the exception to the rule. A significant exception, but an exception nevertheless. Because for every All Black who was a farmer, an equal number of them were accountants, closely followed by lawyers. The most common occupation of All Blacks, at a time when they had occupations beyond professional rugby player, was school teacher. And yet, the point I get at here is that when the game periodically descended into cycles of crisis, there was nobody calling for a return to traditional values by putting more accountants back in the front row. The instinctive reaction is always a default to the rural and to some of the elements of that sort of overarching rural Arcadia I mentioned earlier. So it's always been the consistent reaction. It's the reaction that came out after 99. So what? Well, for one thing, it's a plausible myth, in a sense. New Zealand's urbanism is not of a scale of some of the countries. You can be in the city and be in nature. So you can see some plausible elements for some of this. But I immediately go to the very last one. Anyone who's spent a good deal of time watching NPC rugby over the last few years and not on my Sky, so have watched the ads. There are a fascinating number of ads for sheep ranch, pasture supplements, rural insurance. I really don't know whether the advertising executives assume that only rural New Zealand is watching the game, or whether they want that to be the case. I think I really need a marketing and advertising specialist to work with on this. But as I say, the point of all of this, in many ways, in terms of linking history, is so what? Who cares? Why does it matter? I think it matters on two levels. One is that whether you like rugby or loathe rugby, it has been a significant part of New Zealand society. Politically, sporting contacts with South Africa, perhaps latterly Fiji, which I've written on. Economically, in terms of some of what emerges around bidding for major events and the usually exaggerated claims about their economic returns. Culturally, in terms of various ideas and stereotypes of the New Zealand male and some species of quintessential masculinity. Those things are important to understand in relation to rugby more generally, where it's come from and perhaps where it's going. The other part of this is I have seen and heard, read and heard over the years, a good deal of invective directed at professional athletes for failing to perform to expectations, for failing to perform to the standards of the past. Some of it fairly hostile, pretty much all of it based on a very distorted understanding of history and of forces acting on sport. And I think some of that is highly problematic. Now, I'm not suggesting for a moment that I can somehow kind of fumigate all of the rabbit holes of the internet with the historian's equivalent of aluminium phosphide. What I am suggesting, though, is that we need to try. So I'm now more than committed than ever to bringing a lot of my my work together, articles, chapters over the last 20-something years into a single volume history of the relationship between rugby and New Zealand society, which is not the same as a history of rugby. It's a process that I approach with considerable trepidation. In the past, when I have critiqued aspects of the cherished beliefs around the game, I have been savagely reviewed in the Southland Times and the Wanaka Sun, respectively. It seems that there are people who are not impressed by pointy-headed academics questioning their cherished beliefs, even when the grandfather of the pointy-headed academic scored a try against the Springboks. So the history, just two things I want to touch on. One is the first depth in the New Zealand rugby game. Auckland Stockbroke in 1877 had the unfortunate habit of running headlong into opponents when trying to tackle them and came off second best. And the verdict of the coroner, rugby is a game fit only for savages. Why that's significant is that it points to a long history of internal tension within the game, about acceptable levels of masculinity, about appropriate conduct, about concerns about rough play. So there's criticism from without rugby on many levels, but there's significant tension within. So the idea of a unified national game at almost every decade falls victim to introspection and unease. So that's part of it. And even Richard Lowe in the 1990s said, hold on a second, he said, the rugby union once banned me for 6 months for doing the thing that you now want me to go onto the field and do. The second part at the other end of this work is to consider the impact of professionalism. Chris Wiley, ex-All Black, coach, Glenmark Club stalwart, moustache model. Wiley had this to say a few years ago, and again, it's typical of an introspection of people turning in and saying that it's the administration of the game that is stuffed, and that's a technical term, the game. And anyone who's also seen the documentary The Ground We Won, Referoa, will pick up elements of this too, that professionalism has not been good for rural rugby. I have a bit of a different view. I think the forces that changed the game, the forces that have changed many aspects of New Zealand sport, especially beyond the cities, but also in many ways within the cities, can be traced back to the neoliberal economic reforms of the fourth Labour government and beyond, and a sense that reduced rural services, the end of SMPs, declining rural workforce has had a profound effect on team sport in particular, and labour-saving technologies. And finally, we come to the cows. There is, I think, fairly abundant evidence that dairy conversions, rural milking timetables, moving day / gypsy day, I feel uneasy using that term these days, and the transience of some of the rural workforce has not been good for team sport in many contexts. And so I think the issue here becomes, are the explanations within a sport, or are some of the explanations sitting beyond it? And the other point there, maybe it's not sport per se. I think in some parts of the country you could put together a very good football team of Brazilian and possibly Filipino farm workers. But as one rugby club stalwart observed, they're not much into rugby. So is the issue sport per se or sporting choice? So from that, I've become very interested in, and hopefully in conjunction with my colleague in Sport for New Zealand as co-author Jeff Watson of Massey, I'm doing some more work around sport and social capital in rural community, seeing how that has tracked over a longer period, not just in rugby, not just in terms of the impact of professionalism. And there are some other intriguing dimensions to this. People complain quite often about change, but when you suggest that if you want to go back to the way things were, for example, well, there'll be no more professionalism, there'll be no more super rugby, then they sort of shuffle, go, oh, okay, I want things to go back to the way they were, but I don't want to give anything up in the present. So there's an intriguing tension there. I'm also intrigued, loaned and important identity that certainly in a rugby context and some others, that some of the teams in the smaller provinces now rely on players loaned from city competitions. I'm intrigued as something of a passionate admirer of the very successful South Canterbury rugby team, that it's had quite a preponderance of Pacifica players over the years in a part of the world that was not renowned as a Pacifica hub. I think there's something interesting to be pursued in that. In another context, there is a significant role for RSE workers in particular in some of the sporting structures. So I think there's a piece of work that needs to be revisited there. I did touch on it a few years ago in a chapter called Cows in the Heartland. And rural racing clubs. So that's Kamara. The decline of rural racing club, or the decline of the racing industry more generally, but also rural clubs, is a part of this and worth exploring. So, if anybody's keeping score with about 5 or so minutes to go, We've done rugby, racing and cows. Time for beer. What you'll see that I'm getting at here is I'm critical of and I'm skeptical of some of the extremes. Some of the extremes that have been written in academically, on journalists, popular accounts about aspects of the history of New Zealand sport and some of the claims for masculinity. And in that context too, I'm skeptical about some of the notions of the drinking culture that purportedly went with it. Historiography of alcohol in New Zealand seemed to sit at two extremes. One was a considerable emphasis on the campaign to ban the stuff, religious-based, which nearly succeeded in New Zealand around 1919, but was still a significant element in our politics for a long way through the 20th century. The second part, at the other extreme, was an overemphasis on the 6 o'clock swill, the early closing of pubs and the supposed depraved binge drinking culture. And the former was, of course, a reaction in some senses to the latter. My argument in Continuous Ferment, the history of beer and brewing, was that the truth is always somewhere between the extremes. It's more nuanced. It's a bit like living next door to a Lincoln student flat. Occasionally it's noisy. Most of the time what goes on is relatively normal and harmonious. And so I put considerable emphasis in the work I've done on sociability, around drinking, conviviality, the importance that people placed on what they were actually drinking and the circumstances in which they were drinking it, about the value that beer seemed to have as an indicator of prosperity, importance of the industry in terms of barley, hops, etc., that it was recognised as having a role in society beyond simply drink. Now, I don't suggest for a moment that the New Zealand drinking culture was ever quite as refined as the DB marketing department tried to suggest to us in the early 1950s. But where this has led me in recent times, and there are interconnecting strands between some of these parts of my research, I am now trying to look at some of the historical links between sport and alcohol. But what it's led me to as an extension of beer is the pub, and that's the one down the road circa 1940. There's a kind of conventional portrayal of the pub as drinking place. Well, if it's drink you want, stay at home, it's cheaper. Probably do it alone because you don't have to spend your money on other people. That's not why people go to the pub. So we need to broaden our thinking as we sport beyond some of the stereotypes. So I've become intrigued by the notion of the pub, not just as the drinking place, but as the third place. What do I mean by that? So home and family is considered to be the first place. Work is the second place. Pub, another place, the third place, the place where one can relax and socialise publicly. Rosalind Kerr, don't laugh that I am evoking sociological theory right at this moment. So as I say, that's where I'm going, and some of it does link back to the sporting strand of the research as well, because as a historian, I am uncomfortable with generalizations based on interpretations at the extremes. I'm in search of nuance. I'm in search of balance. So I will continue walking backwards into the future, with my gaze very firmly fixed on the past, if only to make damn sure the myths aren't following me.
Thank you, Greg, for that very entertaining presentation. We got plenty of time for questions.
It's a time. I didn't
You
want to
too. That's a wonderful time. So, he starts for questions. Yeah, please.
Have you considered the impact of the law on drinking behaviour and male behaviour and so on? For instance, I don't know if it still exists, but in a public bar, you're not supposed to sing and dance. You're supposed to get on with your drinking of the piss. But when I was a young chap, we regarded it as a great achievement to persuade the girls to come to the public bar with us. And for instance, on the inter-island steamer, they very definitely applied the law.
Yep.
If there was any suggestion of happiness or on the rowing at the Wellington regatta, you were invited to leave to come to the bar.
You're right, but it's also in some ways it does become again some of the visible extremes. If I was really brutal, I would say that some of the worst excesses of New Zealand drinking culture were precisely because of botched attempts to prohibit it. But yeah, absolutely, the public bar was an entirely male domain in many respects. We pretty much had a cap on pub distribution for a long time. So at one point, I think Hokitika had one pub to every 295 people. Hamilton had one pub to every 4,000 because the ratios have been set static and not changed for about 50 years. The beer was weak, but you do have some of the cultures. And when you have a two-party political system, nobody wants to change much because nobody really wants to be the party that antagonises the swing vote. So yeah, we do get a lot of that, the oddities of the law, and we also get a lot of the most colourful writing around this is by overseas visitors to New Zealand, usually trying to sell books about their time here. That's where you get the most graphic accounts. But if you dig into some of it, again, some of those things are some of the visible extremes. And I did write somewhere once, that it is a little bit like living in a neighbourhood as I do in Ireland around the time of the student orientation. A lot goes on at certain points, and then it doesn't at other points. I can follow through on that. So I don't deny anybody who went through some of the oddities of New Zealand law and drinking processes. But I think there are other places to put an emphasis as well. Yes, the beer was awful.
Yeah. I wonder, Greg, I've always thought, why rugby in New Zealand where rugby in other places in the world is generally played by people at universities? Why didn't we inherit the working class rugby league football mentality with the people coming from overseas?
Well, first part, rugby league comes later as a break off from rugby union as a conscious working class reaction. Why in New Zealand? Partly luck. Well, luck in the sense of the people who founded various football clubs came from different English public schools, generally with different backgrounds. And the thing about the death of Pilling in 1877 is interesting because that triggered a really significant and ongoing debate about what should we play. Should we play the round ball game? Should we play a game that involves less aggressive tackling? The rugby people had essentially won because Auckland, which played rugby, got itself organised and decided to launch a provincial tour. And everybody else who wanted to play them was obliged to fall into line. It was about as simple as that. So the people who had played versions of, say, Australian rules converted very quickly to rugby. So in a sense, it's sort of coincidental. Some people have suggested that rough grounds in New Zealand's damp climate are not ideal for the round ball game. But yeah, some of it's luck that then sort of feeds on itself. By the early 1880s, it becomes clear that we are much better at playing rugby than New South Wales. So success sort of feeds on success. But it is a strange one, and it is quite keenly debated.
Yeah, a question about education. What's the history? How the rugby player when they were young engage in the rough and tumble activity? Because now in New Zealand, the early childhood teacher, whenever there was an accident happen on the face, on the brain, on the head, they have to call the parent.
Yeah.
So the teachers are very inclined, reluctant to allow the children to engage like a rough and tumble. And any compare and contrast study between the New Zealand case and ancient Greek?
I think there are elements, and again, it does come back to something I said before. And people who are close to the centre of rugby now will know that there are intense debates within the game about the acceptable level of risk, the height of the tackle, constant tinkering with the laws to try and get it right. So there's that part. One thing I will just say that I find intriguing about that notion of the feminisation of the teaching profession. I was very strongly influenced in my studies at the University of Canterbury by a group of left-wing Catholics, all of whom had their formative rugby coaching experience from nuns. But yeah, I think that it absolutely epitomises a debate which, to me, again, is not new. It's been with us since the beginnings about acceptable risk, about acceptable conduct in this sport, and actually, Grant, in yours as well.
I was going to pick up on this, sort of this interesting, the first death associated with some sort of tackle, and this appears to be an ongoing right now, looking at the risk associated with sport, with head injuries and the major research programs associated with concussion in particular. It has continued this thread the whole way through.
Yeah.
Since 1878, I think, when the first death was to now.
Which is depressing, but in a sense, it does give the present a context. We're not dealing with something entirely new, and maybe that determines the way we look at some aspects of it and think about it. I'm not entirely sure how, but yeah.
Okay.
Do we grossly overstate the significance of rugby to New Zealanders? Because I recall, particularly in the days when we regularly beat the English in rugby, it's usually fobbed off by the British press as well. You know, it's a religion over there, and that was sort of an excuse. But to my insight, football seems to be much more of a religion in the UK than rugby is to us in New Zealand.
I think you're right. I want to get out of this room live. I'll be very careful about it. But again, I think that comes back to some of the history that I'm trying to work through at the moment to put the game in context. I think where the Wanaka Sun took particular exception to my 1905 book was to suggest that the reason the All Blacks were so successful was that when they got to Britain, they only played the rump of the rugby union game, which was the public schools, because all of the hard working class had already split off or been kicked out and gone to play rugby league, and about 15 times more people were playing the round ball game. So New Zealand's success was based on a fairly small sample size. That argument does not go down well in some quarters, but I think it does reiterate there are those periodic notions of rugby as a global game. Yeah, it is, and it sort of isn't. And as I say, it worries me sometimes about that lack of perspective. And that's where I come back to that point about professional athletes. I've seen things directed at professional athletes, which I think I'd include, some of our own sports scholar alumni, which are out of proportion, which are hostile and based on readings of something that I think are overstated and unhealthily so sometimes. So yeah, I kind of like sport, but I like perspective.
James, perhaps the last question.
We've just been thinking about this. The reason I played sports was I could get to booze afterwards, and hopefully some girls would come and watch play. That was the motivation, I think, and it gave us something to do if you grew up in a small rural town in the 1980s in New Zealand. Do you think that people playing sports now in professionalism, it's the same thing? Or are they looking at it now as a career or a money-making option?
I think on your first point, did I not arrange the therapist after your first talk? No, I think it's both. And why I want to go back as well to some of the notion of sport and social capital in some of the smaller towns is it different in places that don't have as many leisure alternatives as the city or other environments where there are some places less options? Does that then create a greater emphasis on the role of the sports club in some of the more traditional team sports? Possibly. I think anybody, you've got to have a passion for your game. I don't think you can rise to the top in a sport if you've just got your eyes on the prize. So I think there must still be that sense of camaraderie and of the joys of playing. But over the years, it's been some interesting behaviours. I mean, you see players drop from top teams. Do I knuckle down, work hard, and try and get back into the top team, or do I take a contract somewhere else? And I think each to their own, but there are some interesting questions about, kind of what shapes motivations and some of the career decisions further down the line. But I don't think anybody could go into the game just with their eyes on the retirement package they might come out with. Any game.
Great.
But now you know what I do.
Greg, it's the absolutely enlightening presentation talking about their history, connection to cows, which I appreciated, and it's absolutely it's intriguing to think about these things and to think about how history has shaped both New Zealand, our sport, and those implications for us here at Lincoln University. So thank you very much for the presentation today, and thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. So thank you. I realise as long as it's not DB, I'm fine. I realised during the course of this that I promised to write at least 2 books, and as my role in the Lincoln history, I'm beginning to conclude that Q, you'll have to make sure I've got decent Wi-Fi in the rest home.
Thank you very much, and please join us in the foyer for drinks.